Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. It's Friday, we're headed into a weekend, but plenty of things around. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. Anger today as 9 Palestinian flags were hoisted above Federation Square in Melbourne. The Palestinian Advocacy Network says, well, this was all planned a year or so ago, but given how tense things are, it's madness the Premier allowed it to go ahead. The local Jewish community, of course, rightly, is angry. Another big development in an already precarious situation in the Middle East. US fighter jets are striking 2 Iranian locations in Syria, Iranian-linked locations in Syria. We've got an expert update tonight from Malcolm Davis. Plus, big reforms to the legal system regarding cases of sexual assault. Now, what does it mean for those making the allegation and also for those then defending it? More on that with legal writer Chris Merritt. And Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, she was at her best today in Senate estimates, chasing up senior bureaucrats who were evasive about exactly how long the Uluru Statement really is and what involvement they had in implementing truth and treaty.
The use of the word long, does that imply that the one-page version of the Uluru Statement from the Heart is an abbreviation of a more detailed proposal?
It was called long in that file name from 2017 in that it contained all of that additional material. The Prime Minister and others since have stated that, the Uluru Statement is that one page.
It was extraordinary. I'll get into that a bit later on. But first, don't be fooled by all the glad-handing and hoopla in Washington, D.C. Because if Anthony Albanese doesn't quickly regain his political authority, this could easily be a one-term Labor government. A government that's so invested in a referendum that failed is inevitably much diminished after the result. And a Prime Minister who broke all the rules, thinking he was bulletproof and that his signature legacy project might sail through just on the vibe, only it didn't, it was never going to, no longer gets the benefit of the doubt from voters. If the government has looked shell-shocked over the past fortnight, well, that's because it is. Green left Labor MPs really thought the country had moved their way. They thought the voice couldn't lose. Knowing what happens inside the ministerial wing, I suspect the PM thought his trip to America would give him that reset. And sure, he made a couple of well-judged speeches in Washington and Joe Biden gave him a rare state dinner. But the president himself hardly seems in command of events, and the pair of them together, well, they look more overwhelmed than in charge. Now, if Israel's ground offensive into Gaza makes relatively short work of the Hamas terrorists, and if the US aircraft carriers now in the eastern Mediterranean intimidate the Iranians from escalation, and if the Ukrainians continue their incremental but steady gains against the Russians, maybe America will again look like the indispensable, preeminent world power. But until then, the leader of the free world will look more and more embattled and less assured. And as for our own Prime Minister, well, how can you gush in Washington one week only to gush in Beijing the next without looking hypocritical or confused? Perhaps when he was laying out his diary back in January with the 50th anniversary of Gough Whitlam's historic visit looming this year, Albanese thought, let's bask in the reflected glory because we Labor types, we love our symbolism, don't we? But 10 months on, why would anyone of sound political judgment go to Beijing right now? Go to their capital and be seen, rightly or wrongly, to be dancing to China's tune? Now, obviously, the world's turn for the worst post-pandemic was always going to be a challenge, but it's been compounded by Labor's own poor policies. The Prime Minister's problem is not merely that he faces daunting strategic circumstances and acute foreign problems as well, it's that his government can't help making a bad situation worse because of its climate and identity obsessions. It's never been more important to keep our economy strong. And sure, Labor boasts that it's achieved 1, possibly 2 budget surpluses, except these surpluses, if they arrive, are not driven by government policy. They haven't been achieved because the government's spent less or because the economy has become more productive. They've only happened because of the accidental blessing of high commodity prices, because coal and gas prices, as well as iron ore, well, they've been historically high. And this means the government has been the undeserving beneficiary of extracting the coal and gas that most of their Labor MPs think we should never touch and should stay in the ground forever. The mining industry, well, they know that government policy is doing them damage, quite apart from the growing number of industry figures saying quietly that energy policy is a slow-motion train wreck. The mining industry, the Minerals Council, they've just announced yesterday $24 million of an ad campaign against the government's IR changes. Now, these changes are so serious that BHP alone thinks it'll cost them upwards of $1.5 billion every year. Then there's the NFF, the National Farmers Federation. Well, they've also launched a big ad campaign accusing the government of a green-driven vendetta against farmers. Now, the farming sector, don't forget, they were the one sector that kept us out of recession during the GFC. With half a year now, a year and a half until the next election, it's all quite redeemable. That requires, of course, the PM to get his mojo back. Now, I don't think he will. He's spending far too much time in the air, not behind his desk, as PM should, and doing the diplomatic rounds rather than putting his focus on the issues that are breaking so many Australians right now: the cost of housing, power, petrol, food, insurance, education and more. Now, this is where Albanese's effort should be, but isn't. The Voice vote was a vote in favour of constitutional equality, and it was a huge rejection of identity politics. But it was also a vote against all the changes that governments forced upon people without asking them first, like the ubiquitous acknowledgements of country, like the routine flying of the Aboriginal flag co-equally with our one and only national flag, like the stealth campaign to give cities Aboriginal names, and like the leftist propaganda denying the existence of women and girls anymore. Instead, we're reduced to pregnant people, not pregnant women, people who menstruate, as if men have a period, chest feeders, and it goes on. If the government think that voters will put up with this, that they can push on regardless with treaty and truth, despite the crystal clear verdict 2 weeks ago, then Labor's political judgment is off. The voters' punishment will be harsh and swift. We will soon find out whether the lifelong left-winger in Anthony Albanese can rise above his past and reset his government.
Children throwing rocks with helicopter gunships, with tanks and with missiles.
The voice must be followed by truth-telling, because until we acknowledge the reality of our history, we are shackled to its demons. And truth must be followed by a Makarrata Commission. Makarrata is about conflict resolution, justice and, crucially, self-determination. It's a path to national treaty that acknowledges the pre-existing rights of people in a land where sovereignty was never ceded, that acknowledges that we are on what is Aboriginal land, always was, always will be.
That's our Prime Minister, as opposition leader, saying sovereignty was never ceded. Can a leopard change his spots? Well, so far, that's not looking likely. All right, let's get the Canberra headlines now. Sky News senior political reporter Trudy McIntosh.
Good evening. The Prime Minister is on his way home after a week in the United States. The AUKUS submarine deal dominated discussions on the final day. The State Department hosted a luncheon to honour the alliance with Australia.
And Australians always pay our way. We pull our weight, we do our part.
For AUKUS to proceed, key parts need to be ticked off by Congress. Mr Albanese met US Senate leaders and the new House Speaker, Mike Johnson, to try and ensure its passage.
I really look forward to working with you. We, of course, have important legislation required for AUKUS, and we're certainly hoping that the Congress can pass that legislation this year.
And the states have failed to reach an agreement to immediately ban the use of engineered stone products. That's despite a long-awaited safety report finding it poses an unacceptable risk to the lives of workers.
We have a substance which is being compared to asbestos for a reason.
Bo Hull is one of thousands of stonemasons who've contracted silicosis after years spent breathing in the deadly dust.
It's killing me at the moment. It's just really getting to me. Yeah, I'm just worried about how long I've got left to live. It was disgusting, like having the dust all over you. You could smell it on you breathing it in, you could feel it on your teeth, in your mouth. Yeah, I think it should be banned for sure.
Stone benchtops are common features in kitchens right across the country. The issue is not just when they're first installed, but if they're disturbed during renovations. The report also calls for a licensing scheme for tradies who'll be working with it in the future.
We will be dealing with this as a legacy product for decades to come.
States kicked the can down the road after workplace ministers met on Friday. They'll reconvene later this year to hopefully strike a national deal.
I want, as soon as possible, for people to be safe when they go to work. It's as simple as that.
The construction union warns the delay will be deadly.
My message to the WHS's ministers is simple. You have a moral obligation to act. No more prevarication, no more delays. Let's get on with the job. Let's ban this product now.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
All right, let's wrap what's been a big week. PM, of course, in Washington, soon off to China. The fallout from the voice referendums continuing. The latest inflation data suggests the Reserve Bank may well hike rates come Cup Day. But most alarming, of course, the situation in the Middle East continues to develop. Today, those airstrikes in Syria from the US, destroying 2 facilities used by Iranian militants. And it comes just days after the US, including NATO, sent aircraft carriers, battleships, warplanes, etc. into the region. There has been some Australian support. We'll get to that with Malcolm Davis as to the extent of what we're doing in the region, but pretty scary times. Joining me now to go through all of that, Chief of Staff to Senator Pauline Hanson, James Ashby, and Radio 2GB host of Overnights, Luke Grant. Gents, great to have your company. It's Friday. It's been a pretty hectic week. Yes, there's been no Parliament, plenty on. James, I'll start with you. You heard my comments, I'm sure, at the top of the show. I said it was a good visit to the US by the PM, but when isn't a visit by an Australian PM to the US a good one? The relationship's strong, the alliance is there. More of a concern to me is this visit he's got to China, and given all the domestic issues at home, and they are serious issues, they are really dragging people under, I feel like this government has been in limbo. I mean, it's obsessed with the voice. The PM's been up in the air more than he's been behind his desk. Things are getting harder and harder and harder for anyone much to make ends meet. I reckon it's time he got back to his day job. What would your advice be?
Well, every time I see Anthony Albanese fire up the government jet and head overseas, I always worry for the Australian people because I'm wondering what deals he's signing our country up to. Now, of course, the relationship with America is a good one, let's put it that way, but when he heads to China, that's a completely different story. China, kind of like the friend that, you keep at arm's length because, they're only using you to try and get to your wife. I don't trust China, and neither do most Australians. So the longer we continue this false relationship with them, the more it frustrates Australians. I want China to have a trading relationship very similar to the one that I have with Coles or Woolworths. I walk in, I do my shopping, I walk out, we're done. I don't invite them over for, weekend barbecues or anything like that. That's the relationship we should have with China. They're not our friends. They are long-term, potential enemies. That's why we're spending $364 billion on submarines. We're not doing it to keep boat people out. We're doing it to keep China at bay. So wake up to the Prime Minister, stay home, deal with our domestic issues.
And just echoing those comments there from James, Luke, the Taiwanese foreign minister was basically saying to the West, you guys need to be warned. I mean, China's trying to play you all. It's playing the United States, Europe, Japan. It mentions Australia. Yeah. And Taiwan says we have to keep a very clear eye on whether China is taking advantage of calmer relations with democracies to then put pressure on Taiwan. I think he's absolutely right, the Taiwanese foreign minister.
I think he's right too, and what worries me most, Peter, is that our government isn't going to wake up to that or don't have the backbone to actually take that advice. I fear here perhaps the deal's been done. You know, the Port of Darwin lease, Chung Lei being released, some of our exports being allowed back in, or at least talk of that. I don't know what much will happen out of this 3-day visit by the Prime Minister. I'm a bit like James. I hope not much. I hope they just shake hands and respectfully agree to disagree and move on. But look, you know, you have to take them seriously, even though it is Sleepy Joe and the President of Taiwan you take seriously too. You know, please be guarded, Albo. Please be on guard.
And look, you are right. I know exactly how this works. You are right to say there's got to be some relationship between us rolling over on the Port of Darwin, because Labor said they were going to get rid of that deal with the Chinese before the election. Now they're getting this warmer relationship. They've rolled over. Chung Lei's come back. That is a good thing. But tariffs and other things look like this is part of a two-step dance. James, Senate estimates. I know that's been a big focus for you this week. Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price was in there today. She really went after the NIAA, the National Indigenous Australians Agency.
Yes.
This is the agency that released under an FOI the full 26 pages of the Uluru Statement. And the PM got himself into a bit of trouble in question time, and suddenly it was reduced to a one-pager. But this is a militant 26-page document. It's got financial compensation, all of that. Have a listen.
What is the NIAA's explanation of the use of the word long in this particular context?
We are aware that the FOI referred to a range of different documents. Those documents and those file names were transferred across directly from the Referendum Council, so they weren't created by NIAA.
The use of the word long, does that imply that the one-page version of the Uluru Statement from the Heart is an abbreviation of a more detailed proposal?
You know, it was called long in that file name from 2017 in that it contained all of that additional material. You know, the Prime Minister and others since have stated that, you know, the Uluru Statement is that one page.
Okay, Ms Braun, have you ever been present where the authors or anyone else directly associated with the drafting of the statement has indicated that there is a longer version of the Uluru Statement from the Heart?
No.
So I'd like to table a list of nearly 20 occasions where Pat Anderson and Megan Davis have publicly referred to the Uluru Statement from the Heart being more than one page.
I reckon that's game, set, match, James.
Well, she did well to get what she could out of them. I really wish Scott Morrison never created the NIAA to start with. They're a body which obviously falls under the Prime Minister's office. But look, she did well to get that. Senator Hanson and other senators from all sides of politics don't bother going to estimates so often these days because it's very hard to get answers out of these bureaucrats. I must take my hat off to Jacinta Price as well. She also managed to find out that the Central Land Council had spent $600,000 of funds promoting the yes case as well throughout the whole referendum period. So it was a pretty good day for Jacinta. I must take my hat off to her.
Goodness me, I didn't pick that up. $600,000. Goodness me. Makarrata, though, Luke, that's still on the table, isn't it? Look, Makarrata, despite the overwhelming vote of Australians who didn't want the softer entry point of a voice, no to a voice, but we're still going to have treaties.
And it'll happen somehow. I don't trust the government. I don't trust the government to accept the verdict. I just don't. And whether it ends up being something leaked one day or discovered at Senate estimates, I'm not sure. But there'll be something going on, you can rest assured. These are agenda politicians. You know, as I often say on air, you like to think you elect people who might make your life a little bit better. These people got elected to implement their own progressive agenda, and they won't take no for an answer, Peter. I don't trust them.
Hey, James, last one to you. Foreign Affairs have told more than 15,000 Australians, dual nationals, in Lebanon to leave now. Concern, obviously, if the war spreads to the north of Israel. I tell you, I hope our government is security checking everyone coming out of Lebanon, 15,000 of them. Yes, they're, you know, dual nationals, but I want to run the ruler over them. And same goes for any Australians in Gaza. Before they come home, we should know who they are.
I completely agree with you, Peter. The reality is these 15,000, yes, they may have dual citizenship, but they spend the majority of their time in Lebanon. They've got no interest in Australia until war breaks out, and then all of a sudden they want to call themselves Australian. Look, bringing these people back anytime soon is the wrong message to send. I hope we don't offer those repatriation flights, certainly for free. We don't have anywhere to bring them. First of all, try and get a house for them at the best of times. And the same applies, I noticed Peter Dutton's comments this morning on 2GB as well. We've got nowhere to put these people. So if you're thinking about bringing additional refugees from Gaza over here, number one, we're going to have an issue housing them. And secondly, are they the right fit for Australia? I think there's better countries for them to go. Iran, first stop, off you go.
Yeah, and I'll say to some people, I've seen some on this network thinking that, Peter Dutton's playing politics here. He's not. He would have had years' worth of briefings about people in that region. The little I know says it's a tinderbox. Be careful who you bring home. So, when he speaks as a bloke that's been the Home Affairs Minister. Just quickly, Luke, we're, I think, about 12 months out now from the Queensland election. Next year, this time, Anastasia Palaszczuk reckons she will be there facing off against David Christodoulou. Her performance ratings now, it's as bad as Anna Bligh and Campbell Newman. She's at -20. LNP's now got the lead over Labor at 52-48. Well, do you reckon she's going to be there? Yeah. And if she's not, who'll replace her?
The video and her assurances she's the only one that can lead convinced me that she's under all sorts of pressure from within. There's a bloke, a listener from Cairns, calls the Ghost. He's a cabinet minister. He said, you know what, Anastasia, we're all behind her. Oh, and by the way, we've got heaps of other really good people. I mean, you can't write this stuff. I think she's gone, Peter. I hope she's gone for the people of Queensland. Too much addiction to the red carpet, not enough attention on the good people of Queensland.
We will see. When they say they're behind you, they're generally not. Luke and James, have a lovely weekend. Catch up with you next week. All right, coming up, big changes proposed for our courts when dealing with sexual assault cases. I'll get you all the details in a moment. And what's next in the Middle East? Those US attacks on Iranian assets in Syria. That's huge news today. We'll go through that in a moment. Coming up, are we entering a new period of denial as journalists, including our ABC, question the severity of the Hamas terror attacks on innocent Jewish civilians? But first, we've learned today that there's a new report looking into reforming the way the justice system approaches cases of sexual assault. And that report's been handed to the states and territories. The report was commissioned by the Federal Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, through his department, and it comes in the wake, of course, of the highly publicised rape trial of Bruce Lerman, who was accused of raping colleague Brittany Higgins, of course. That was aborted due to juror misconduct, an allegation that Lerman has always denied. Now, this is a sensitive area, no doubt, but we are talking about some fairly drastic changes being proposed here, including an investigation into jury-less rape trials, a crackdown on inappropriate questions from defence lawyers, and a ban on wigs and gowns in court. Joining me now, legal affairs contributor at The Australian, Chris Merritt. Chris, as I said, sensitive area, but justice is absolutely important that we have that debate and the thrust and a parry about any sort of changes like this to see if they are in everyone's interest. What do you make of these reforms?
Look, my main concern is the premise, the underlying premise and the starting point. It's clear that this report is not primarily concerned with the right to a fair trial and the administration of justice. It's primarily concerned about easing the trauma on people it describes as victim survivors. Now, that might sound reasonable, but the use of that term victim survivors is used throughout this report for people before and after a prosecution that fails, i.e. an accused person has been acquitted. So that's the concern. I'm worried also about the logic of some of the proposals, particularly the idea of juryless trials. I have every. I would strongly endorse giving judges discretion to dispense with a jury in matters where they think it's impossible to get an unbiased jury, or the jury pool's been fatally tainted by prejudicial publicity. But that should be up to the judge. It should not be a ham-fisted, blunt approach saying in sexual assault cases there shall be no juries. And the reason why is this being floated? It's not to ensure that that justice will be done. It's to insulate a trial from what it is concerned about, which is rape myths, what it says is rape myths. Now, I would have thought that if evidence is given in a court which is completely irrelevant, it's up to the judge to pull the counsel aside and say, look, that's just not on. And if there's a practice, a consistent pattern of this happening, well, it's very easy to change the law to say this is what the Evidence Act shall say. Other things, such as dispensing with wigs and gowns, the reason for that is to be more supportive and provide more privacy. Look, the bottom line here is that criminal courts are not run by social workers. They're run by lawyers and judges who are there to administer justice fairly on behalf of the state, not on behalf of any particular chosen party, whether it's the complainant or whether it's the person accused of a criminal offence. Changing the culture of the place to make it more like more supportive for one side, I would have grave concerns about this. Now, all that said, this is simply proposals that have been run up the flagpole by the Attorney-General in this report. This report's been distributed to the states. It's one-sided. It's clear that it comes at this very important issue from one perspective. And I think that needs to be understood before the states take it on board and start implementing these ideas. It needs to be assessed on a different basis on what's good for the administration of justice and how do we preserve and protect the right to a fair trial.
And just so people at home understand, the whole point of the wigs and gowns is so that you are seen to be in a courtroom forum, having justice administered by the state, not by any of the individuals present. That's why they're gowned. And of course, the concern about juries, the implied sense of that report is that, the rape myths argument is that juries must be made up of stupid people. So if we get rid of those people, we get rid of those myths. I don't think that's fair. I think the whole point of an adversarial system is if you think that's there on the table, you can test that. The defence and the prosecution can test it. But calling someone a victim before there's been a finding of guilt against the person who has been accused of a sexual assault act, if they're not found to have committed the crime, then they're not a victim. I mean, I get the point after the fact if there's been a finding of guilt, but it's a bit concerning that you get the real sense that there's premeditated assessment or a prejudgment of the case with this sort of language.
I think it goes beyond that. I think it's a failure to accept the reality that when a court acquits someone who's been accused of a sexual offence, that person's presumption of innocence remains intact. And the thinking that underlies this report is that those who complain about sexual assault are always victims, always survivors, regardless of what a court might say. I find that very worrying.
Yeah. Me too. I've got to leave it there, Chris. Thank you for taking us through that. It will play out. Of course, it's only a draft report and the states have carriage of the Crimes Act where sexual assault sits, but it will be a debating topic in the future. Thank you for your time. Right, let's go to the Middle East. Those events in Syria, huge news today. The launch of US airstrikes destroying 2 facilities used by Iranian militants. I mentioned before the US, including NATO, have sent aircraft carriers, battle groups, etc. there. There has been some Australian support. We'll get the details of that in a moment. And we've got the Israeli Defence Force poised with ground troops to head into Gaza. Australians in Lebanon, as we've mentioned, have been told, come home. Iran-backed Hezbollah to the north of Israel is ramping up its activities. So none of this is good. And someone to help us make sense of it all, senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Malcolm Davis. Take us through the latest, Malcolm.
Okay, so what you've had very recently is 2 US airstrikes against targets that essentially were Iranian-sponsored and Iranian-backed militia groups in Syria and Iraq, with the aim being to attack those groups and send a message to Tehran to stop attacking US forces in the region. There have been a number of attacks by these Iranian-sponsored groups over the last 7 days, and now the US is starting to fight back. And the question is, how does Iran respond now? And to what extent does the US get increasingly involved on the ground, shall we say, in this fight?
What do we know about the assets we've sent? I mean, very little is out there in the public domain. I read that it was aircraft. They've mentioned troops. I don't know what that troop complement looks like or the size of the deployment even. What can you tell us?
Look, it's not a huge deployment. It's essentially a C-17 that has been deployed into the region to assist with evacuation of Australian nationals. There's also an MR-30 tanker transport aircraft that essentially is there to support the deployment. And there's a few hundred ground troops on the ground, essentially, to assist with that nationals evacuation operation. So it's not a combat operation per se. We're not sending in fighters or warships or anything like that. What we are doing...
Okay, so Malcolm, just let me jump in there. So we've sent in troops to basically service the air deployment. We haven't sent in special forces somewhere in the theatre.
If we had sent in special forces, I certainly wouldn't be talking about it, and probably the government wouldn't be talking about it. So the understanding is, based on government statements, is that these are just regular troops designed to go in and support the nationals evacuation operations.
All right. What did you make of Peter Dutton's comments that we should be careful about anyone repatriated from Gaza and, of course, anyone returning from Lebanon?
I think it's a sensible step. I think that we need to be cautious of people who have been for a long time living in that area. We're not saying that there's a presumption of guilt or anything like that, but we do need to do appropriate background checks. And I think that particularly if these are dual nationals, I think it's only appropriate that we do that. So I think whilst it's important not to, shall we say, racially profile these people, at the same time, national security interests are uppermost here. And if this war really does escalate rapidly, which is quite likely in coming days and weeks, then Australia would have to be on its guard for internal security risks. So I do think that we should take appropriate measures as we bring these people home.
Let's just go back a couple of days to the Prime Minister's trip to Washington. We know he met with a number of top Republicans. They've got some nervousness about the AUKUS submarine deal. Basically, it's a bit like old Adelaide here. It's about the build and the implications for the localised economy, as far as I can see it. Where's this up to? Do you get a sense that it was sort of moving after the PM's trip?
I think the AUKUS agreement is moving ahead slowly. I think that there are some concerns in terms of, will the US Congress be prepared to ensure that we do get the first of those Virginia-class boats in 2033? I think all bets are off, potentially, if Trump gets a second term. But we would continue to work with the US national security community in the Pentagon, in Congress, and in the Oval Office to try and ensure that AUKUS stays on track. Because after all, it is in America's interest to work with us in terms of AUKUS, both in terms of the nuclear submarines and also in terms of Pillar 2, the advanced technologies area, to make sure that it succeeds. Because if it doesn't succeed, if it falls apart, either because of US domestic politics or because we can't get our act together and ensure that we're ready to operate these submarines, then we lose credibility, they lose credibility, and the Chinese just gain at our expense.
We will talk to you very soon about the trip to China. It's coming up, I think, the 4th of November. The Prime Minister departs. Malcolm Davis, thank you. All right, coming up after the break. There's been no denial, has there? You know, all this talk about Linda Burney becoming the next Governor-General, it's still on the table. Plus, why Palestinian flags are being flown in the Melbourne CBD. We'll talk to someone concerned with that fight today in a moment. Welcome back. Coming up, Labor frontbencher, federal frontbencher Tony Burke has backed the flying of the Palestinian flag by a council in his electorate. At the same time, the PM tries to convince us his government supports Israel. But down to Melbourne, where 9 such Palestinian flags today have been hoisted at Federation Square outside Flinders Street Station. Now, the Palestinian Advocacy Network, who organised this, they say it was planned a year ago. But given the current climate, it's madness that no one, including the Premier, thought better. All the while, Melbourne's Jewish community, quite rightly, is mourning the worst attack on Jewish people since the Holocaust. Joining me now to discuss this, Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party in Victoria, David Southwick, who is the local member for the seat of Caulfield, an electorate, of course, with a very significant Jewish community. David, thank you for your time. I think I echo most of my viewers. How on earth, this is Fed Square in the centre of Melbourne, how on earth was this allowed to happen?
Oh, look, Peter, this is quite unbelievable. Initially, the community reaction was maybe someone had photoshopped the flags into Federation Square. I mean, seriously, this government, the council, the Federation Square management are all tone deaf to think that flying flags in this time where the Jewish community are living in fear, they've got more anxiety than I've ever seen before. Most people won't leave their homes, let alone go into the city, because there's been rally after rally inciting hatred to Jews. We've seen genocide, calling for genocide to the Jews. And now we've got this. It's beyond belief that someone would allow this to happen. And if you compare at the moment, today in Times Square, there is an empty Sabbath table with 220 chairs around it for the hostages that have been taken by Hamas. Whereas we in Melbourne, in our Federation Square, have 9 Palestinian flags. There is something definitely wrong with this picture.
I initially thought it was something to do with the Melbourne City Council, so I contacted the Deputy Lord Mayor, Nick Rees. He said it was nothing to do with them. Do we know who was involved? Have they been taken down?
Yeah, so a few days ago I had contacted the Mayor, Sally Catt, because there was meant to be a National Day organised for today, and the council understood the sensitivities and said they were going to delay that event until next year. So they were certainly on board with that. And then we woke up to the horror of these flags, and then was told that it was the Federation Square management, controlled by the Allen government, that actually that gave this the go-ahead. You've got Martin Foley, the former health minister, he's the chair of the Federation Square management. We were told that the flags would be taken down, and then ultimately, when there was community uproar about these flags, and now we're told that the flags won't be taken down until after the vigil that's being done tonight, which we're also being told just moments ago that potentially the Minister for Multicultural Affairs will be addressing that vigil. I mean, seriously, we've got people that will talk out of both sides of their mouths. You've got the government on one side saying that Israel has an absolute right to exist and defend itself, and calling the atrocities that they are, but then are quite comfortable addressing these kinds of rallies that call Israel horrible things, call Jews horrible things. This is unacceptable. We're meant to be such a tolerant state. And quite frankly, this is the most divisive thing we've seen in a long while, the fact that we'd have these flags raised in Federation Square.
I'm going to get to this in a bit more detail with my panel, but I've got to ask you, I think in the aftermath of the massacre, there was a numbness and I think a general outpouring for Israel. But there's been a very deliberate campaign of misinformation, propaganda pushed around by Hamas, of course, to terrorists, but so many in the media are almost putting on the same level information from a terrorist group and information from a democratically elected government, the government of Israel, to the point that the Israeli government had to put the journalists in the room and show them some horrific vision this week just to amplify the point. This is what happened, and you've got to stop denying it.
Well, look, the IDF have never, ever had to react the way that they have in real time to take journalists and show the horror that has taken place because, quite frankly, we have so many other things that are made up on the other side, and we need to show that there is the balance. I mean, there's not even a balance here. This is a terrorist attack. If the same thing happened with 9/11, you would never have this kind of situation where you try and normalise it. You try and compare it. There is no excuses for anything that's happened right now, and I just can't believe that people are trying to show some equality with any of this piece. And the Jewish community are peaceful people, and Israelis and the Jewish community do everything to save life. That is what we believe. That is who we are. And you've got Hamas, which do everything to take life. You can't compare that. And we are the first to call for innocent Palestinians to be saved. And one of the things that's really disappointed me through all of this is the fact that you've got these activists not joining together for calling the end of Hamas, because that is the way that the Palestinian people can live peacefully. And we should be unified on this. And we should be on a unity ticket. The common enemy is Hamas. And to even think that journalists, that those from the left, other politicians would try and give some kind of excuse for this is completely, it's beyond belief. We've got many in our Jewish community at the moment, they won't attend school. They are taking the holy scriptures off their doors because they don't want to be identified by maybe an Uber driver. I've got people that have completely wiped themselves from social media. They are living in fear at the moment because you've got people that are trying to attack, trying to use this as anti-Semitism against Jews. We've just never seen this kind of thing before. It's unacceptable. And I think I'm calling for people to be rational, reasonable. This isn't a time for a history lesson. This is a time for people to show some humanity against the Jewish community that are being targeted disgracefully during these times.
Thank you, David. Thank you for your time. All right, after the break, I must say a lot of journalists do need a history lesson. The information that I read is extraordinary. They need to look at the last 100, 200 years before they open their mouth, some of them. We're going to look at the federal redistribution. It's on the table. It'll mean some places like Victoria will actually lose a seat. We'll talk about that after the break with the panel. Welcome back now. I want to pick up where I left off with David Southwick. This whole issue about the media, because since those attacks, the Hamas terror attacks on October 7, many journalists have refused to believe that factual information about the atrocities is real. And that's forced Israel to do something extraordinary, to get a whole lot of the media, put them in a room and then show them the harrowing footage that was filmed on CCTV from in and out the kibbutzes and the body armour of people there as the civilians were slaughtered simply because they were Jewish. Now, journalists, including at the ABC, have questioned reports that Hamas terrorists beheaded babies, raped women and girls and tortured young children. And one of the journalists in question, well, he hasn't lost his job, he's simply been moved to Turkey. As the Israeli spokesman Elon Levi said, we are witnessing a Holocaust denial-like phenomenon evolving in real time as people are casting doubt on the magnitude of the atrocities that Hamas has committed against our people. Joining me now for more, the panel on a Friday, as always, Prue McSween, Tina McQueen. Ladies, welcome, Prue. We're of a generation where you grew up, you had the Holocaust front and centre at school in the curriculum, less so nowadays. I've had the great honour to meet Holocaust survivors, the children of, the grandchildren of. I mean, this is sort of within all of our lived memory. And remember when, was it Steven Spielberg set up that Shoah Foundation so that people could be interviewed and their stories about what happened to them and their families could be recorded for life, because he feared in the years and years to come, people would say it didn't happen. Now look what's happening now. Within a matter of 2 weeks, people are already trying to downplay what happened Sunday 2 weeks ago.
Well, there's absolutely no doubt that Israel is losing the propaganda war, and of course the forces are against it, Peter. You've got journalists of all persuasions right around the world who are always so left-leaning and have been anti-Israelis for years, as we know, who are developing a narrative that they believe, is the right one. And, it took Israel, a while to decide that they had to release these shocking, confronting images just to remind people that this was an attack on innocence. And Hamas engineered this. We all have sympathy for the Palestinians, who, of course, did vote for Hamas, but are now captive victims of Hamas. And we know that there have not been any elections since. But, of course, they are subdued and, their whole lives. I mean, people talk about how bad the Israelis are for preventing water from coming in. It's only responsible for 10% of the water and the oil that goes into Gaza. Hamas is restricting it all. As we know, they dig up the pipes to make bombs. So the propaganda is, not being won. It's being won by the Hamas and also all the other Muslim countries around who have decided that this is an opportunity to hop on the bandwagon and stick it up Israel and create a narrative that is really creating problems. And sadly, it means that, they're being leaned on, Israel is being leaned on not to go in and eradicate Hamas.
Peter, I recall studying this at school, the rise of Hitler and what happened. And I always thought to myself, how could the world sit back and watch this happen? And I'm aghast that, again, the world is sitting back and watching it happen. I'm in disbelief. And watching those Palestinians continuing having their protests around Sydney disgusts me. I've had enough. They're not protesting against Hamas. It's disgraceful and time for it to stop.
No one said to Churchill, you can't go in after the Nazis. You might kill a few Germans on the way trying to eradicate the Nazis. We didn't have that conversation then. It's very different when it's the Jewish people. Linda Burney, just quickly, what do you think? Should she be the Governor-General, Prue?
No. I mean, they obviously need to shift her out of the ministry, but has she got the ability to represent us? She's a Republican anyway. The whole thing's hypocrisy. It's just moving her out of, a very inconvenient area and again, Albanese trying to write himself into the history books by having the first Indigenous female.
I know, but she fails up, this woman. All she does is fail up from New South Wales politics into Canberra and into the GG's job. Hey, just quickly, Tina, John Pizzuto was put under some pressure today on Sky, asked whether or not he supported treaty. He said, we're still working our way through it. This is a Victorian
what a drop kick.
Alan Payne, you go.
He's a drop kick, Peter. There's only one answer to that. Straight out, no. The Australian public has voted. Even Victoria have made their feelings, been very clear on the way they feel about this issue. What a nut job. Replace him. Absolutely replace him if you've got any chance of winning the state election in Victoria.
And just quickly, we've got a federal redistribution. Are we worried about that at the Liberal Party or not?
We are a little worried, but we'll wait and see what that produces, Peter.
I'm worried.
All right, ladies, geez, we got to... You're always worried, Prue. I'm worried with you. Have a good weekend, girls.
Thanks,
Tina McQueen, Prue McSween. There you go. Everyone, thank you for your time. I'm not with you next week. I'm away next week, but you'll have the wonderful Rita Panahi here. Then I am back all the way through until Christmas. Thank you for your company. She's up next. As I said, I'll be back in a week's time.